Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today, I have with me Tobias Sturzen. Having grown up in a religious cult and later confronted his toxic culture, Tobias evolved into a prominent advocate for the vital importance of cultural health for organizational success and human flourishing. His advice is sought after by leaders facing their most daunting culture challenges, whether navigating rapid growth or dealing with the fallout of highly publicized scandal. As a co founder of Heart Management, a culture change agency, he has designed high impact culture and leadership programs and trained thousands in values driven leadership globally. His clients include many purpose driven large corporations and organizations. He hosts the top ranked leading transformational change podcast, featuring biweekly conversations with renowned researchers, executives, and experts on culture, management, and ethics. A native of Sweden, Tobias finds inspiration from exploring the world with his family. And he has a book coming out called You Can Culture. Welcome to the podcast, Tobias.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. Great to be here.
So, congratulations on, I know you just sent your book to the presses to be printed and everything. So,
I did.
congratulations
Yes,
on getting to that point. I'm sure it was a huge feat.
it was. I'm very, very grateful to have it done. It's been a 7 year journey writing this book. So it's a good feeling.
7 years. So, tell me what you mean by it's been a 7 year journey.
Yeah, so in 2017, I started. I didn't necessarily know that it was going to turn into a book at first. I started writing, and then was my wife who encouraged me. I think you should do something more with this, and then I started writing on a book. But since then, I've been writing, I would say, several books in the sense that I've processed so much, both of my own story and the work that we're doing with leaders and organizations. I've had the opportunity to learn from so many renowned researchers, leaders in organizations across the world over these last years that have really influenced and helped me. I think get to a much better place of being able to share a message that I truly hope and believe will be helpful to a lot of leaders and really really practical as well. So it's been a journey, I think, both of finding my own voice of uh getting the confidence to share my story, but also really making the message clear and practical. And I think so many times we underestimate how much work that is to actually take what you're passionate about, what you know, and then getting it to a place where it's really really yeah, where it's really practical and actionable. So that's
Mm.
what I've been trying to do.
Oh my goodness, Tobias. I can't even tell you how much I relate to everything you just said. Yes. It's to try to take kind of some of these more abstract concepts or these ideas and turn them into something practical that people actually can bite into is sometimes a little difficult, but it's so important.
It is absolutely. And I think when you're truly passionate about something and you think that there's something that you need to bring to the world, and for me that's been really that desire to see healthier cultures, to see cultures where people can thrive, that where organizations can deliver on their missions and do it in a way that really has a positive impact. I think that you're kind of you're willing to stay the course. You're willing to keep doing it, even though it was so much harder than I would have ever thought. But being on the other side, I'm so incredibly grateful that I did and that it stuck to it.
And now you'll have it in that form. It's just there's something really special about that. So congratulations.
Thank
Um,
you.
so I'm curious if you talk about your personal story. So I haven't read the book or been able to look at the book because it's just you've just finished it, but I'm curious if you talked about your story at all inside of that book.
I absolutely do, and I actually start the story in or I start the book with that story. and I start telling an experience of watching my mom, who was really, and our family was a part of this cult, and or you could say Christian community that turned into a religious cult. And I watching my mom on television as she's telling a national broadcast audience about her experience within this cult and how it led her to several times try to end her life. So that's kind of where I'm starting the story. I don't, or starting the book. I'm not spending super much time digging into it, but in one way I do, because partly in the book I really look at it through the lens of my own experiences and asking the questions of how can an organization that has seemed driven by a noble mission turn into something so toxic, and how could I, who would have seen myself as an ethical, values-driven leader, become complicit in psychological abuse? So those questions are really a lens that I'm looking through as I'm writing the book, and as I'm also, and what I've learned through the years is that by sharing my story, uh, uh, and being vulnerable, because you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position, sharing a story like that, and being kind of labeled as this former cult member, but that it actually opens the door for other people to be vulnerable as well. And I just the other day had one more of those experiences where you see, okay, but this was really a door opener to someone being able to open the door to their story.
Mm.
And as the book, as a very important theme, or in the book, is humility and getting vulnerable, then it's just right that I do that myself.
Mm. So, if you don't mind, then I would like to ask you a little bit about your experience. I've spent a lot of time thinking about researching cult-like behavior as well. And so I'm curious, like, what point did it dawn on you that you were in a cult?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think that's a very gradual
Mm.
process in that sense. So it's something that, and especially when you're grown up in something and that's been kind of your world. So let's say we became a part of this community, and it didn't at the start seem like a cult. It seemed like a Christian church, and like more of a regular kind of church. So it was like over time it gradually shifted. Of course, there were definitely, I would say, red flags at the beginning, but having been a part of that since I was 10 or 11, something like that. And so uh, I think it's something, that kind of gradual feeling that something is not right. But I think
Mm.
totally understanding, being able to actually put those words on it, I was only able to do after I left, to actually be able to name it a cult, because before
Yeah.
that I wouldn't have at all dared to go there in that sense.
So what were those things that kind of you didn't feel quite right about along the way?
Yeah, and I mean there were a lot of them, and I mean, looking at it in hindsight, there were so many different things that should have made me, walk out the door and never come back again. So there were so many
Right.
things that were off, but of course a lot has to do with very toxic leadership, with very kind of being into to every detail of people's life, a lot of control, a lot of manipulation, and then of course the mistreatment of people that I also became complicit in. So you also have to reflect on your own responsibility in that, but I mean, including my mom and others. And then after that, kind of, because after that season, you could say there was a shift where some of those, if you say, those worst tendency were not so much a part of it anymore. There was not that uh, sense of demonization and isolation in the same way, but still there was no real desire to deal with it. And of course there was this incredible protection of the leader and
Mm.
their position and influence and so on. So I think lot of things there. And I think one thing, of course, is also to that there's not this open environment to really question and so on and have contrary opinions.
Mm. Mm. And I'm sure looking back on it is totally different than when you were in it, because when you're underneath of that kind of cloud, it's pretty hard to see very clearly. Um, so I guess could you give us like kind of a big picture overview? Was this a one particular leader that kind of ended up becoming they were really dynamic and they ended up becoming really micromanaging and they're the person that turned it into a cult-like environment? Or what do you think were some of those dynamics that that now looking back you can say that this is probably what happened?
No, so I would say that definitely, a charismatic leader with this kind of sense of a big vision that people rallied around, and that seemed really exciting at first, and then increasing isolation. But
And what does
de
that look like? Do you
definitely.
mind if you share, like, what do you mean by increasing isolation?
Yeah, basically that. I mean, a lot of people left, and for the people who stayed, we were, and I think it's creating this narrative that this group, this environment, we are the ones who have the important mission, and
Special
we are the ones
knowledge.
who, yeah, and all of that, and of course
Yeah.
with that you create this dynamics where uh you can sit there and you're a small group and you think that you've got the answers that the world needs, but at the same time you're very disconnected from the larger worlds, and we spent so much of our time involved in this community. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you really believe that your message is correct, that you do have that special mission, special knowledge, that um, it's really hard to see anything else.
Yeah, absolutely it is. It is. And you can start rationalizing a lot of things. And I talk about that in the book as well.
Mm.
This idea of, for example, moral licensing, that we think because we're doing something, and in this case, it wasn't at the end of the day that good, but you think that you're doing something so good and
Yeah.
important. So you start kind of protecting yourself. You start to look away from whatever red flags, or you say, okay, but this is not necessarily so good. And I see that maybe this is off with the leadership, or this is not maybe so great, but we're doing all these great things, and this is so important, or this person has such an important mission or whatever. So those of course becomes these protection mechanisms.
So there was that sort of isolation that kept you from really diving into, I assume, other like the other influences or knowledge bases outside of your group. Were you involved in like like a school system that was outside of the group, or was it inside of the group? Like when you were growing up, was that also a way that you were isolated?
Yeah, so we were involved in a school system inside the group. So of course that definitely added to the isolation. Totally. Yes.
So you said that when it sounds like when you were maybe older, I don't know at what point you started to be complicit in, I don't remember how you put it, but some sort of harm toward other people. Um, do you mind sharing what that looked like? And because you're such a nice person and obviously a very thoughtful, caring person, even just talking to you, you can feel that. And yet, I know that I even know things that I have done in the past that I'm like, whoa, how did I? So, so I'm wondering what you experienced or what you did that you were like, whoa, wait a second.
I think really the demonization. So this leader would point out people and say that they had all these bad things about them, and that we should distance ourselves from them, or a part of it is, and of course becomes like a bit religious language here, but exorcism and stuff like that in a uh very unhealthy way.
Yeah, so that sort of demonization though I think can happen even in smaller ways. So I know that while it might not be the experience of the listeners to have this big, be in a cult per se, or even realize that they're in a cult, I think cult-like behavior can happen outside, right? I mean, I'm sure that's part of what you're talking about, and I'm kind of wondering like what is a smaller version of that sort of demonization of people?
Yeah, and I mean, I think of course in most organizations are very different from this, but I think in all organizations that there can be tendencies that like lead in the in a similar direction, and we can, for example, look at examples like at France Telecom, the French telecom company, where they were driving this change process, and they uh they needed to get rid of a lot of people, but to there was kind of a big change in the telecom market, and they saw they needed to get rid of thousands of
Mm.
employees, but they didn't have the legal rights to do that according to French labor law. So they created this system of where they would kind of identify people who they saw as dinosaurs and who they should get rid of, and then let managers kind of try to get them to leave the company voluntarily. So, for example, they would push someone to, for example, somebody who's been working as a technician for 30 years. Suddenly they would put them in customer service without any training, or somebody who was taking care of their sick elderly parent were moved to another city where they couldn't care for that parent, things like that, which actually led to a suicide wave at the company. So I think those things can of course show up in different way in all organizations. And what I think is important to see is that if I think about my own complicity, in when we have issues within our organizations, within our culture, it's very easy to think, oh, the problem is just this or that person. But I
Mm.
think so many times it's it's more of a systemic approach. I mean, if we look at this case, this leader wouldn't be able to do anything without followers, wouldn't be able to do anything without people who were standing, who were nodding, who were accepting, who were encouraging, who and of course looking at my own story, I can see how I wanted to get approval, how I wanted to be accepted, how I wanted to fit in. And I think those drivers are true for all of us. And that's why I think, and even when you as a listener might look at your organization, and you're not at all facing these type of things, but it might be other things where it's so clear that it's not just one or a few people, but it's actually about people who are standing around, and or maybe somebody has said something but no one wanted to listen, or they didn't act, and so on. So that's
Mm.
also something I really
Yeah.
want to encourage people in my book to think more from the perspective of, as leaders, how am I contributing to the system? What role am I playing, both in terms of what leads to cultural health, but also what might lead to that something becomes unhealthy, hindering, or even toxic.
Just even recognizing, I think sometimes it's hard to even recognize that we're in that situation, that we're um, kind of silencing ourselves or like telling ourselves to be quiet because we want to be a part of it. Like there's like maybe a in versus out dynamic. Like you want to be on the inside, you want to be in the in group. And if the people on the inside are appealing and they seem happy and they seem like they have a mission and all that kind of stuff, you want to feel like you're a part of that. So I can see how easy it would be to keep yourself quiet in those situations then when you start to have those questions, because you don't even want to believe that that other person might just be unhealthy, using unhealthy or undue influence.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think our desire to fit in is incredibly strong, and that can really lead us to become blind to a lot of things, and I think that's why we should not. It's very easy to assume that we would act ethically. We would stand up. We would leave. We would do all these different things. But I think it's not as easy as we might think. And I talk in the book about this idea that many times we're not as ethical and values driven as we think or as we want to assume. And I've asked lots of leaders to rate themselves on a scale on how ethical they think they are, and leaders will generally rate themselves very high. And there's a Professor Anton Brunsel, who's done this with hundreds of people, and where she's found, and she told it to me in this way, that we have positive illusions about the variety of traits, but when it comes to how ethical and values driven we have hyper illusions. And there's other studies that's seen that show that even prison interns think that they're more ethical than people are in general. So I think it's really important to, as leaders, as organizations, to think that we are much more susceptible uh, to unhealthy influences than we might think. That there are blind spots that we don't see. That there are reasons why we might end up in tunnel vision when we're facing a decision, and suddenly those values that we said that we should stand for, that we want to claim, they're not at all even a part of the equation, because we make the decision on totally different parameters. So I think it's so incredibly important that we have the humility to see that, and instead assume that we're vulnerable, that we don't, for example, claim on our websites and say these are our company values and they guide all behavior and drive all decisions at this company, because that's not true of any organization. If we want to abide by those principles and values, then that's going to be tested when it's costly, and we're going to have to intentionally work to make sure that that's going to be the case.
Mm.
So I think that is true in any organization.
Mm. Okay, one more question about recognizing it. What do you have any particular red flags that you want the listener to know about? Like, hey, if you're seeing this, pay attention. Consider that this might be happening at your organization or whatever organization you might be in, whatever high control group you might be in.
Yeah, and of course that's a question of whether kind of what you're looking to identify, but something that I see as really this sign of an unhealthy culture, I think, is silence.
Mm.
So that it's not safe to bring up concerns. It's not safe to question. It's not, and in some cultures, and I've seen examples, for example, where it is that there's a culture where everyone is just supposed to be positive the whole time. So
Yeah.
which can be a really great thing. I mean, to be positive and optimistic and having a positive view of the future. But if you feel that you can't raise concerns, if you feel that you can't point out that something is off, if you feel that it's not possible to question leadership, then I think that's a sign that something is off. And I truly think that cultural health deteriorates in silence. For us to really sustain cultural health, we need cultures where it's safe to share those things, where it's safe to speak up, and where it's encouraged, even where we solicit the feedback. And that's one of the practices that I encourage leaders to really take on in the book, because I see that it's so incredibly critical to sustaining cultural health.
Mm. And that was gonna be where I was gonna go next. Is just like, what about the leader who is concerned and doesn't want and wants to make sure that they're not doing that, that they're, what are some of those things that could be sliding in, and they don't even realize that maybe they're doing it, and it's starting to create an unhealthy culture.
That's a great question. I think entitlement, I
Mm,
think can be like a big thing. So because I think the leadership ultimately should be about service. And I think when I start to feel like I'm entitled to be served, that I'm entitled to get something, and I start talking about these people who never understand or who never listen or whatever, I think that's definitely something. I think another thing to be reflect on is when I feel that I'm so stressed and so pressured that I don't have the time to stop and reflect on my decisions and actions. I
mm,
think that's another aspect, because I think that's also something in that situation where we can easily start looking away from things because we just don't want to deal with them. So I think those are things to look for. Then on the other hand, and I think, and I talk in the book about that, when we think about cultural health, that I really kind of use the analogy of physical health when I think, because a lot when organizations try to drive culture change, they do it in a very project perspective. So we're running this HR or ethics and compliance project, and we're going to do this months, or we're going to do these events to talk about our values or whatever that is. But much of that doesn't lead to really any lasting value. And so the picture that I use is that, just as with our physical health, our cultural health is not built by what we do just sometime or occasionally, but it's built by what we do repeatedly, and it's built on our habits. And their leadership habits are so important, because it's about what are the signals that we're sending to the culture of what is encouraged here, what is rewarded here, what do we turn a blind eye to here, what is prioritized here, and so on. So another way to look at it, if we would like compare it to our physical health, we could look at our physical health and say, okay, if I start seeing these health scares or these signals, that's one way to identify it. But another way to identify it is seeing, do I have healthy habits in place? And if I don't, that's probably something that should be a warning sign that I'm perhaps not headed in the right direction.
that's a really good point. So, healthy habits, you mentioned reflection as being one of those things. I'm curious what kind of reflection, or what do you recommend when it comes to reflection?
Yeah, in the book I talk about four habits, and each of
Okay.
these habits have three practices that really make it actionable and clear. And what I really want leaders to see, that this is not a quick fix. It's something that we need to be working on. We need to develop these habits, and that takes time. And that's also why I encourage people to do it over a year, to do it bit by bit. But one of those, the first practice I talk about in the book is about embracing vulnerability. And I give, in every practice, I give people this action to take. And the first thing there is the action of personal reflection, and reflecting on your values, and reflecting on how have I lived, or how have I acted in line with my values, with our company values, with fundamental values, and where have I acted in conflict with them.
Mm,
And if I think about the decisions that I'm facing, where are they leading? And to stop, and I encourage people to do this on either daily, or at least one or a few times a week, and set some time aside to do that. Doesn't at all need to be a lot of time. I mean, some leaders do it, taking a walk. So for me, for example, I'm an early riser, so I do this very early in the morning. I take time to read a bit, and then I sit with a journal, and I sit and reflect. And then so that's one aspect of reflection. Another aspect is to do it together as a team, to make it into a ritual in your organization. And so I really encourage teams, and including leadership teams, to make a ritual on a regular basis, weekly, bi-weekly, or at least monthly, to ask those same questions. How have we, as an organization or as a team, acted in a way that has been in line with our values? How have we acted in a way that has been conflicting with them, and where there have been concerns or dilemmas? And what I found with that is that this takes practice. It's not something that we necessarily do perfectly at the start. We're going to have to keep doing it. But as we do, we're going to see that we're going to get a lot of things up on the table and start discussing them that would have otherwise not been acknowledged. And so both it helps us see the positive things, the strength that we should make sure to really celebrate, but it also helps us to see the warning signs.
That's a really helpful description of reflection, and I like the idea of a leader doing that on their own, and then also making it a ritual with your team. And it sounds like you've got some other habits in there that people should read about when they get your book. Um, what other what's another key aspect of your book that you want to make sure to highlight for us today? Is there something else that you're like, I really want to talk about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think another practice, since we're talking about like a culture of silence and how we create instead of culture of listening, and that is the practice of soliciting feedback.
Mm,
And so it's not assuming uh that it's safe for people to bring up feedback, but instead assuming that people don't feel safe. And so we realize that when we as leaders, when we are in a position of leadership, our power might silence others. And
mm,
I think of
mm,
myself, personally, I'm not a very, I would say, aggressive, domineering type of leader, but still, because I have a position of being in charge over someone's work, over their employment, even their salary. I mean, all of those power differentials can create different fears and just make it harder to bring things up. And of course there are lots of other ways that we might have power as well, whether it's through, for example, being in I might be the person with a certain degree, or have been working within the organization for a certain amount of time, or just other types of privileges and so on. So really the practice of soliciting feedback is that I'm not assuming that things are going to come up on my table. So I'm asking the question. I'm asking people. So for example, what do you see in my leadership that I should uh, change to help you thrive better in your work? Where do you see that I'm not acting in line with our values? Like asking those type of questions, and not asking if, but asking where, and
mm,
where and what. And so being really specific, going after and just assuming that something is there. So for example, if let's say that a leadership team presents a new company strategy, it's very, very easy that the leader will come up and say, okay, this is our strategy. So if you have any questions, please ask them. Of course, people are not going to really ask any questions, but if the leader instead would say, so I know that you have questions, and I know that you might have concerns and even fears about this. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to take, let's say, 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and we're going to get everyone to write down your concerns or fears, and also what you're excited about. And then we're going to take the time to reflect on that together. So
mm,
being intentional about soliciting feedback. And another practice that ties to that is the practice of creating the right conditions for brave conversations, and being intentional as a leader, not just of how am I going to get my message across, but how am I going to create space for conversation that will really invite people to share their perspective and do it in a constructive way. And I think some leaders might be scared of that and think, oh, what's going to come up on the table, and will we have time to handle that, and so on. And that,
yeah.
again, it takes practice, it takes training, and we're going to have to give each other feedback as well to learn to do it in a constructive way. But if we do it continually, if you continue to practice, we're going to see that it's going to make a huge difference.
I really, really appreciate that notion that like, hey, let's just say that this is an experiment. We're trying this out and we're going to keep trying it out and keep getting
Yeah.
better at it. And let's not expect it to be handled perfectly the first time. I think in general that's a great practice in business, but yeah, especially around feedback and when you're not used to or haven't had this practice before, that's really good. I like that. There's a couple other things that you talked about that I made note of. So when you were talking about soliciting feedback in that group, you said, first of all, that you should assume that there is something that people want to say. And I think that that's really, really good. And that a lot of people don't, like you said, because it's uncomfortable. You don't want to assume, you want to assume the opposite. But then you also said, by assuming you're creating that space, like you were talking about too, by saying, here's what we're going to do. We have a process. And not only that, it's an anonymous process because you're saying you can write it down on a piece of paper instead of having to raise your hand in the group, which is sometimes really, really uncomfortable for people and they just won't do it. So I thought that was good too. I've noticed that sometimes we think we're creating opportunities and creating space, but then the way that we do it doesn't end up working. People don't speak up. And so I assume that we should just say, okay, well, if that's the case, if people aren't speaking up right now, I should still assume that they have concerns and that they're
Yeah.
just not comfortable right yet. And so I need to try a different thing.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And that we should assume that, and not kind of hide behind the thought that, oh, this group, they just don't have anything to say, but instead assume that it's there and that it's really in our interest to get it up on the table. Because the thing is,
Yeah.
these things will be said anyway. They're just going to be said in different forum. So instead, you're going to have to deal with a lot of gossip. You're going to have to deal with a lot of just that there's a lack of alignment, that there's just a lot of things that are kind of rumors swirling around that are not contributing well to the mission of the organization. So it is in your interest to get it up on the table and to ensure that you have good conversations about it. And I think a really helpful perspective here as well is that when we think about people speaking up, we think that they have different rationalizations and objections that might hinder them. And here I'm building partly on Professor Mary Gentily's work. She's written a great book called Giving Voice to Values, and talking about, for example, that the idea that, oh, but it's just the way things are done around here. So that's a
Mm.
reason. If I think it's just the way things are done around here, I'm not going to say something. And of course, I can really see that in my experience. Other thing might be, it's not going to make a difference. I've done it before, and it's not helping anyone. Or no one's going to care. Nothing. No one's going to do something. And another, for example, is that I'm afraid of negative consequences, and that there's going to be some type of retaliation, or it doesn't necessarily have to be retaliation, but it can just be that, I mean, somebody just doesn't treat me in the same way afterwards. So when we think about those objections, then we have to think about, okay, so how can I then make that easier? How can I help people overcome those objections? And in some organizations, and I've seen that to be quite common, that there's earlier experiences. Perhaps it was not you, it was somebody else, some earlier manager who was not
Mm.
good at this, who was
Yeah.
instilling fear and silence in the organization. And now you have to overcome that. And then, for example, if you feel that people just don't feel, oh, it's not going to make a difference, then being really, really clear that when people come and bring things to you, that you're really great at reconnecting back and saying, this is what we decided based on the input that you came with. And it might not be what they were asking for. So it might be we actually decided to do something different, but still reconnecting, making sure that they understand that what they said, that it actually landed somewhere, that you took it seriously, that you acted. And for example, if people are afraid that oh, but it's gonna lead to negative consequences, then really thanking people for speaking up. And I bring
Yeah.
up an example from Airbnb. Rob Chestnut, who was in the executive team there, and he shared this story with me of how he had someone who spoke up when he broke some security law, and somebody, an IT manager, spoke up. He didn't close his computer when he went to the bathroom. So a small thing, but somebody spoke up to him and said, "This is not okay here," and did that, speaking up to someone who was in the management team and who was the legal counsel of the company. So that's of course takes some courage. So what Rob Chestnut did was, in a meeting in an all hands meeting, he told them about what this IT manager had done, and told them how courageous he was, and then he gave him this like water bottle, just as a way to show that we appreciate that here, that we celebrate that here. So there we need to be really intentional about thinking, how can we overcome the objections that people might have.
So not just not retaliating, but even celebrating it. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's good.
totally.
I know that some companies talk a lot about wanting to hire for culture fit. I'm curious about what your take is on that.
Yeah, so I think that this has been the subject of quite a lot of debate, and especially when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion, and just if we hire on culture fit, what kind of people are we getting? Are we hiring kind of the people that we think that we would like to have a beer with? Are we hiring the people who went to the same school, who play the same kinds of sports, and so on? And I think that it's better to focus on thinking values fit, and in the way of thinking, these are behaviors that are incredibly important to our organization. Let's say, for example, we are a customer service focused organization. So then we want people who are excited about giving great customer service. And then we need to think about, so how can we, through the questions we ask and so on in the interview process, understand how they have given service, how they what they do when they don't get the results they want, when they give service, when they are mistreated by a customer, or and so on. So I think it's like looking at what are the things that are really important to us, and that shouldn't be, I think, that this would be a great person to go and play golf with, but it should instead be, these are things that are important to us as an organization, to what we want to stand for, both in terms of ethical integrity, but also in terms of our strategic, who we are strategically, and what is important to the culture we want to build, and then try to hire those kind of people. And then again, of course, I think that is a continuous journey for any organization, to ensure that we're not looking at that through a too narrow frame, in terms of, for example, what does service look like, and so on. So of course
Mm.
we still need to be open-minded within that, but I think that's a more helpful perspective than I think how typical culture fit has been viewed.
Yeah. The idea of focusing on values, it reminds me and makes me think that maybe the important thing is to start out with the values that are going to have produce a healthy organization in the first place. So that you're not just hiring. I guess when I hear culture hiring for culture fit, sometimes I get concerned because I'm afraid that we're talking about hiring yes men, um, people that are willing to go
Yeah.
along with what we want to do, and not questioning us, which you have highlighted over and over is not the goal. So if you start with values that that are healthy and promote healthy dialogue and feedback and all that, then maybe you're set up better for hiring for culture fits or values fit, as you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that there's a challenge with what you're saying as well,
Mm,
because and I think you're highlighting something really important, because we want to, of course, we want to have people who are committed to the mission of our organization.
Mhm.
At the same time, we want to have people who are not surrendering their whole selves in that sense to that mission, because we also need them to be independent thinkers.
Mm.
We also need them to be able to say that this is not okay, and this is not uh, in in line with my values or what we should stand for. And I think that's a really challenging tension there. And I think especially if you think, for example, you're working in a startup or something like that, or a very mission-driven organization, I think that's a challenging tension that you need to be really, really careful of.
Mm.
So that you don't get people who kind of just totally just drink the Kool-Aid in that sense, because
Mhm.
you want a commitment, but at the same time you also want people who can have dissenting views.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, good. So, who should be buying your book?
So I wrote the book for managers and executives who want to understand what does it take practically to build truly a thriving culture. And I talk about in this perspective of a thriving workplace, having a positive impact on the world, and having a lasting success that is something that is not just the short-term perspective, that is really good in the longer term perspective. So for leaders who are looking at a really practical journey towards what I as a leader can do, should do, and that will really give a great effect on the culture of my organization if I do it. And I believe very much that it's like the small changes that we repeatedly do, that making those small changes can have a really major impact. And my book, it is one of the people, one of my advanced readers, Marshall Goldsmith, who some might be familiar with. He talks about it as a very like a transformative journey, and I truly think it is. It's not just it's a practical, it's an actionable book, but it's also a book that will really make you think about who you are, who
Mm.
you want to be, and who you want to become. And at the end of the day, I think that's so important. We need to ask ourselves those questions, because our business is personal.
Mm.
It's what we do at work. It influences our lives, and who we become as parents, as spouses, as friends, as contributors to our community. So I think for people who are kind of willing to take that journey and who long for practical way to build a thriving culture, I think this is a fantastic book.
Mm. That's great. Okay, two more questions. Where can people find you and your book, your company?
My company is named Heart Management, and so heartmanagement.org is a great place to go. I love to connect with people on LinkedIn, so please connect with me. Would love to connect with you there. And for the book, You Can Culture is the name of the book, and you can find more information on youcanculture.com.
Great. We'll link to it in the show notes. All right, this is the Voice of Influence podcast. What last piece of advice do you have for somebody who would like to have a voice of influence in their company?
So I think that reflecting on that, sometimes we have more power than we might assume. So to think, and using for those of you who are familiar with Stephen Covey's the Seven Habits, he talks about these three, or he actually talks about two circles, but if we use the picture of three circles, what the circle of control, the circle of influence, and the circle of concern, and that there are things that we can control. We can control our own behavior, we can control our own reactions, and there are things that we might be able to influence. One way might be to speak up to someone, and 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 of course there are things that we're concerned with that we can't influence. But to start there, to start with what can I control, what can I control, and what can I influence, and use those tools to try to drive change. And I think that when we think about building a healthy culture, it's not necessarily rocket science, but it is hard in the sense that it will challenge our comfort. And but I think that's what life is. If we want to abide by values, if we want to have influence, and if we want to have, because I think we want to have positive influence on our organizations, on our teams, on the world, then we need to be willing to sacrifice for values that we don't want to compromise.
Mm,
And I think that's something that all of us need to be reflecting on.
that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and being a voice of influence for us, our listeners. Appreciate it. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Very much appreciated it.